And actually, without him, she's nothing. I don't think they will split yet, but I think she wants to prove that.
Speak without anybody filtering out what she said. She wanted to say the real me, so we'd all get to know that. I think
their family, and you can go on and on for what she said, all the lies she said. So she's not someone.
Something shifted, and the silence was so loud it practically screamed betrayal. Because when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stopped celebrating their own love story publicly, when their wedding anniversary slipped by like it meant absolutely nothing, it wasn't just another quiet celebrity moment. It felt like the first crack in a carefully manufactured illusion that had once hypnotized the entire world. This was the same couple who built an empire out of their romance, who sold their pain, their love, their struggles, and their so-called truth to Netflix, to Oprah, to every camera willing to listen. Yet suddenly, on the one day that should have been their easiest PR win, there was nothing. No heartfelt posts, no nostalgic throwbacks, no emotional tributes, just silence. And in the world of Harry and Meghan, silence has never meant peace. It has always meant something far more dangerous: control slipping away. Because understand this, Harry and Meghan were never just a couple. They were a brand built on emotion, rebellion, and carefully curated vulnerability. Every appearance they made was calculated. Every word they spoke carried strategic weight. They understood the currency of attention better than anyone. They knew how to manipulate headlines, how to dominate the narrative, how to make themselves unavoidable. But now, that power seemed to be fading, and people noticed. The anniversary passed like an afterthought. No media frenzy, no viral celebration, no manufactured magic. It was as if the world had quietly started moving on, and they were powerless to stop it.
She was apparently screaming to the producers, very, very annoyed at what they'd asked her, and I imagine that.
That's when the whispers started. At first, they were subtle. Observations about how different things felt now. Questions about why the couple that once documented everything suddenly chose invisibility. And then those whispers grew louder. Because when someone who thrives on attention suddenly disappears from it, it doesn't look like peace, it looks like fear. It looks like someone hiding from something they can't control. And that's when Angela Levin entered the conversation. Not as some random voice desperate for clicks, but as someone who had watched this family for decades, someone who understood the mechanics behind the palace walls, someone who didn't need speculation because she had knowledge.
Uncle survivors feel vindicated by reports of her demon ways. And
when Angela Levin spoke, she didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply pointed out the inconsistencies that had been sitting in plain sight for years, hiding behind distraction and emotion. She raised the questions others were too afraid to say publicly. Questions about Archie. Questions about Lilibet. Questions about why their births didn't follow the traditions that had existed for generations. And suddenly, everything Harry and Meghan had spent years trying to control was slipping through their fingers. Because this wasn't just random gossip anymore. This was structured scrutiny. This was someone pulling at threads that had never been examined this closely before. And the more those threads were pulled, the more fragile the entire story started to look. Why weren't there clear hospital appearances like every royal birth before? Why did timelines shift and blur instead of staying consistent? Why did official statements seem to evolve instead of remain fixed? These weren't wild accusations. They were simple questions. But simple questions can be the most dangerous kind because they demand simple answers. And Harry's reaction revealed everything. Because instead of calmly shutting down the doubts with clarity, instead of confidently presenting undeniable proof, he exploded. Not physically, but emotionally. His statements weren't composed. They weren't reassuring. They were defensive, furious, panicked. And panic is never the reaction of someone standing on solid ground. Panic is the reaction of someone watching control evaporate in real time. The man who once seemed relaxed, playful, and unshakable had transformed into someone constantly on edge, someone unable to tolerate even the slightest challenge to his narrative. And Meghan, she vanished. Completely. No strong statements, no emotional defenses, no visible support. She stayed silent while Harry absorbed the storm alone. And that silence was deafening because Meghan had built her entire public identity on being fearless, outspoken, unstoppable. Yet now, when everything was under threat, she stepped back, not forward. And that absence raised questions of its own. Because when a storm hits, true partners stand together. They don't disappear and let one person drown in the consequences. The public noticed the contradiction immediately. This was a couple who had shared everything when it served their narrative, their mental health struggles, their family conflicts, their private pain, their deepest emotions. All of it had been packaged, monetized, and sold to millions. Yet now, when faced with something that couldn't be carefully edited or controlled, they retreated behind the shield of privacy. And that contradiction was impossible to ignore because privacy had never been their priority before. Control had been. And suddenly, a single word began circulating louder than anything else. Dna. Not because people wanted spectacle, not because people wanted drama, but because Dna represented something they couldn't manipulate, something objective, something final, something that didn't care about narrative or branding. It was the one thing that could silence everything instantly. And yet, it was the one thing they avoided the most. And avoidance has a language of its own. Avoidance doesn't just delay answers, it creates its own answers. Because the longer clarity was withheld, the more the speculation intensified. Not diminished, intensified. And Harry's behavior only fueled it further. Every emotional outburst, every defensive statement, every attempt to shut down the conversation without addressing it directly, it all reinforced the perception that something was wrong, that something wasn't adding up, that something wasn't as simple as they wanted everyone to believe. The transformation was shocking. This was the same prince who once represented relatability and warmth, the same man who walked behind his mother's coffin with heartbreaking dignity. The same man people had rooted for, defended, and loved. But now he looked different. Hardened, reactive, trapped, like someone realizing too late that the narrative he helped create was now controlling him. And the palace? They weren't speaking either, which only added to the tension. Because when institutions built on tradition suddenly go quiet, it means they're watching, waiting, calculating, and that quiet observation can be more terrifying than open confrontation because it means decisions are being considered behind closed doors, decisions that could change everything. Harry and Meghan had spent years trying to rewrite the rules, trying to operate outside the system while still benefiting from its power, trying to control perception without surrendering verification. But now they were discovering something brutal. You can't control everything forever. Eventually, reality pushes back. Eventually, questions demand answers. Eventually, silence stops protecting you and starts exposing you. And the most dangerous part, the longer they waited, the worse it became. Because what could have been resolved quickly was now evolving into something permanent, something defining, something that would follow them everywhere. Every project, every appearance, every opportunity. The questions weren't disappearing, they were multiplying. And with every passing day, their credibility wasn't stabilizing, it was eroding. They had built their entire post-royal life on storytelling, on controlling how the world saw them. But now the story was slipping out of their hands, and the world was starting to write its own version. And this is where everything began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Because once the illusion cracked, once Angela Levin's words echoed across television screens and interviews, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The questions had escaped containment. They were no longer whispers buried in obscure corners of the internet. They were public. They were visible. And worst of all for Harry and Meghan, they were coming from someone with credibility that couldn't be dismissed as easily as random speculation. This wasn't a troll. This wasn't a tabloid. This was someone who knew the system. Someone who understood how every royal birth had been documented, verified, and witnessed for generations without exception. Because understand this truth, royal births are not casual family moments. They are historical events. They are institutional confirmations. They are recorded carefully because they determine lineage, succession, and legitimacy. For centuries, there was never confusion, never ambiguity, never mystery. The process existed to eliminate doubt completely. Diana followed it. Kate Middleton followed it. Even under intense physical exhaustion, even under global scrutiny, they stood there, visible, undeniable, transparent. They didn't hide. They didn't delay clarity. They understood that transparency was not optional. It was required. But Meghan changed the pattern. She didn't just adjust it. She dismantled it. She replaced certainty with ambiguity. She replaced tradition with secrecy. And that decision planted a seed that would grow into something uncontrollable. Because secrecy doesn't eliminate curiosity, it amplifies it. And as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the silence didn't protect them. It haunted them. People began revisiting old footage, old interviews, old statements. They began comparing timelines, analyzing details, and what they found wasn't reassurance. It was inconsistency, small inconsistencies, subtle inconsistencies, but inconsistencies that when viewed together created a larger, more disturbing picture. And the more the public noticed, the more defensive Harry became. His responses weren't those of someone calmly dismissing nonsense. They were the responses of someone emotionally cornered, someone lashing out not to clarify, but to intimidate. But intimidation only works when people are afraid. And now, people weren't afraid anymore. They were curious because Harry had built his entire identity on emotional honesty. He positioned himself as someone brave enough to speak his truth, someone courageous enough to expose secrets. But now, when faced with questions directed at him, he retreated behind anger instead of openness. And that contradiction was devastating. Because it exposed a painful truth, transparency had always been selective. It existed only when it served their narrative. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something even more brutal was happening. The industry that once worshipped them was slowly backing away, quietly, carefully, without announcement, because Hollywood operates on perception, and perception had shifted. The couple who once symbolized opportunity now symbolized risk. The couple who once represented influence now represented unpredictability. Executives didn't need scandals to distance themselves. Doubt alone was enough. Phone calls stopped being returned. Meetings stopped being scheduled. Projects stopped being prioritized. Not with dramatic cancellations, but with silent indifference. And silent indifference is the coldest rejection of all, because it doesn't offer closure. It offers abandonment. Financial pressure began tightening like an invisible noose. Their lifestyle demanded enormous resources, security, estates, staff, appearances. Everything required money, and money required credibility. But credibility was now fragile. Every unanswered question chipped away at it. Every defensive reaction weakened it further, and every day without resolution pushed them deeper into isolation. Angela Levin had warned about consequences, but the consequences weren't arriving in some distant future. They were already here. They were unfolding in real time. The empire Harry and Meghan envisioned wasn't expanding, it was shrinking. The doors that once opened effortlessly were now closing quietly, and the most tragic part, they had the power to stop it, instantly, completely, because the solution had always been simple. Transparency, not emotional storytelling, not carefully edited documentaries, not rehearsed interviews, real transparency, the kind that doesn't rely on persuasion, the kind that doesn't rely on narrative, the kind that relies on undeniable fact. But transparency meant surrendering control, and control had always been their greatest weapon. Now that weapon had become their greatest weakness, because the public wasn't demanding spectacle. They were demanding clarity. They weren't asking for performance. They were asking for truth, and truth doesn't require defense. Truth defends itself. But defense without proof, that creates suspicion, and suspicion, once born, never fully dies. Harry had spent his entire life fighting institutions, fighting expectations, fighting narratives imposed on him. But now, he faced something far more terrifying than any institution. He faced doubt, and doubt doesn't have a face you can confront. It doesn't have a voice you can silence. It exists everywhere, in every conversation, in every headline, and in every unanswered question. And Meghan remained silent, watching, waiting, calculating, because silence can be strategic. Silence can buy time, but silence can also become confession in the eyes of the public. Their greatest mistake wasn't the secrecy itself. It was underestimating how long secrecy could survive without collapsing. They believed they could outlast the questions. That attention would shift. That curiosity would fade. But curiosity didn't fade. It hardened into suspicion. Suspicion hardened into belief. And belief hardened into perception. And perception, once formed, becomes reality. Now they stood trapped inside the very narrative they once controlled. Every attempt to escape only reinforced the cage. Every refusal to clarify only strengthened the doubts. The world was watching, waiting for resolution that never came. And the longer they delayed, the more permanent the damage became. Because in the end, this was never just about Archie, never just about Lilibet. It was about trust. It was about credibility. It was about whether the couple who demanded to be believed could still be believed themselves. The silence that once protected them was now destroying them. And the most terrifying truth of all, the only thing that could save them was the one thing they refused to give: transparency. 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 Transparency.